the autumn of 1415, England was a kingdom haunted by old claims, simmering rivalries, and long-forgotten promises that had refused to die. Its young ruler, Henry V, stood at the crossroads of ambition and obligation, heir to a throne purchased by force, surrounded by nobles who watched him with wary eyes, and burdened with a legacy of conflict that traced back nearly a century. For generations, English kings had asserted their right to lands in France, lands once held by their ancestors, lands that had been lost, disputed, or retaken in an endless tide of conquest and rebellion. These claims, ancient and uncompromising, had ignited the vast conflict now known as the 100 Years' War. But by the time Henry took the crown, those claims were little more than political ghosts. France was powerful, wealthy, and fractured only by the madness of its king, Charles VI. England, by contrast, was smaller, poorer, scarred by previous misrule. Many believed that Henry would be the monarch who finally abandoned the dream of dominion across the Channel. Henry did not agree. He was young, disciplined, rigid in his sense of duty, and possessed a precise understanding of the symbolic power of victory. A king did not merely rule by law and sword. He ruled by narrative. And Henry sought a narrative that would unify England, silence his critics, and restore the crown's prestige. The revival of English claims to France. War was not just an option. It was the path he believed destiny had carved for him. Yet no one could have foreseen that this path, carved through mud-soaked fields and forests of northern France, would lead to one of the most extraordinary battles of the medieval world. A battle where an exhausted English army, worn down by disease, hunger, and a brutal siege, would find itself confronted by a French host many times its size. And on that field, the unthinkable would occur. When Henry's fleet sailed for France in August 1415, it carried an army well-trained, well-armored, and confident. The initial objective was clear: the siege of Harfleur, a wealthy port city that commanded access to the Seine and the interior of Normandy. Capturing it would give England a critical foothold, but Harfleur proved stubborn. The siege dragged on for weeks. Dysentery ravaged the English ranks. The finest knights and archers found themselves too weak to stand, too fevered to fight. By the time the city surrendered, Henry had lost nearly a third of his men, not to enemy action, but to illness. The army that marched out of Harfleur afterward was not the proud host that had arrived. It was reduced, weakened, hungry, and exhausted. Yet Henry pressed onward. He believed that retreat would be seen as cowardice, that abandoning the campaign now would embolden France and embitter England. He resolved to march his remaining forces to the English-held port of Calais across the breadth of northern France, a bold gesture meant to defy French expectations. But France had no intention of letting him pass. French forces assembled from across the kingdom. Knights of legendary families, armored in the finest plate steel Europe could produce, prepared to intercept the English. They were confident, overwhelmingly so. To them, this was no battle but a capture. The English would be cornered, forced to surrender, and paraded as trophies before the French court. Henry marched toward Calais knowing full well that the French intended to stop him. But he did not know where the confrontation would occur, only that it was inevitable. That moment arrived in late October, near a small village whose name would soon become eternal: Agincourt. The ground Henry found himself upon was no grand plain but a narrow corridor of farmland squeezed between dense forests. To the left stretched the Tramcourt woods. To the right, the thick and tangled Agincourt wood. Between them lay a long, narrow field, recently plowed, soft and uneven even in good weather. It was not good weather. Rain had fallen through the night. The earth had turned to mud, deep and sucking, clinging to boots, trapping hooves. The field sloped gently downward from the English position toward the French, a detail small in appearance but monumental in consequence. And because the French outnumbered the English so heavily, their formations would be packed tightly, layer upon layer of armored men struggling to move through the mire. To Henry, this was not a death sentence. It was an opportunity. To the French, this terrain posed little concern at all. They saw only the size of their own army, glittering with nobility, and weighed down with confidence. Chroniclers estimate the French force at nearly 12,000 to 25,000. Scholars debate the exact figure, but all agree that it dwarfed the English army, which likely numbered fewer than 6,000. The French were so confident of victory that many noblemen argued over who would capture Henry himself, who would take the highest-ranking English lords prisoner, who would profit from the ransoms that would surely follow. Victory was assumed. The only question was who would benefit the most from it. But Henry looked upon the landscape with the eyes of a commander who understood terrain better than any knight arguing in the French camp. He ordered his men to station themselves at the narrow top of the field, flanked on both sides by forests that prevented the French from spreading out. He ordered archers to plant sharpened stakes into the earth to break cavalry charges. He spread his men across the narrowest possible frontage, ensuring that French numbers would count for nothing. What appeared to be an English trap was in truth a French catastrophe waiting to unfold. French knights, resplendent in plate armor, believed themselves invincible. Their armor was the pinnacle of medieval engineering, articulated, polished, beautifully forged, and heavy. Knights trained from childhood in mounted combat placed faith in the weight and momentum of horse and rider. They believed that nothing on foot could withstand a fully armored charge, but the field of Agincourt was not made for charging. The mud sucked at hooves. Horses lost footing. Knights leaned forward to counterbalance, shifting their weight in ways that destabilized mounts. The narrow corridor prevented cavalry from forming the wide wedge formation necessary for breaking infantry lines, and standing opposite them were English longbowmen, soldiers who had trained for years, who could loose arrows at unimaginable speed, and whose weapons had the power to pierce armor at close range. Yet Henry knew that longbows alone could not win the battle. His infantry, lightly armored, exhausted, surviving on meager rations, formed the backbone of the defense. These men were tired, sick, some still recovering from the horrors of Harfleur, but they trusted their king. They trusted the ground they stood on. They trusted that discipline could overcome nobility. The French did not have this unity. Their commanders argued. Their formations were disorganized. Their confidence blinded them to danger. It was the perfect storm: leadership, terrain, discipline, and the French had walked into it willingly. At first light on October 25th, Henry made the boldest decision of the entire campaign. He ordered his weary, half-starved army to step forward. Just a few dozen paces, but enough to seize the initiative, enough to force the French to react. That single movement compressed the battlefield, tightening the killing zone and robbing the French of the space they needed to maneuver. Chroniclers would later write that when the English advanced, it was as though a fuse had been lit, and the field at Agincourt became an explosive waiting to detonate. The French cavalry, positioned to launch the opening blow, surged ahead or attempted to. What followed was not a charge but a collapse. The rain-soaked ground had turned into a thick, hungry mud that resisted every hoof. Horses struggled for footing, slipping before they could build speed, and as they pressed forward, the English longbowmen loosed their first storm of arrows. Thousands of shafts hissed across the field in a deadly, rhythmic wave. Armor that once protected Europe's greatest knights now became a liability. Joints, visors, armpits, every gap became a target. Horses shrieked and toppled. Riders were thrown, crushed, or pinned beneath their own mounts. Those who pushed through found themselves impaled on a forest of stakes hammered into the earth the night before. The charge died not with a grand clash of steel, but with the sound of panicked animals slamming into an unmoving line of wooden spears. The fallen created obstacles for those behind them, turning the field into a maze of thrashing bodies and sucking mud. And then came the French infantry, thousands of armored men forcing their way uphill, shoulders colliding, helmets fogging, breaths burning. Every step drained them. Every slip stole energy they could not spare. Arrows continued to fall like rain upon metal. By the time the vanguard reached the English line, they were spent, disorganized, and fighting the terrain more than the enemy. Henry saw the moment the French faltered and struck. He ordered his infantry to charge downhill. It was a reversal no French commander expected. the outnumbered English attacking with controlled fury. The French line folded inward, crushed by its own weight by panic, and by the unrelenting English advance. As the French vanguard buckled, the rest of the army tried desperately to push forward, but the field had become a living nightmare. Men advancing from the second and third French lines found their path blocked not by English soldiers, but by mountains of their own fallen. Knights tripped over the dead and dying, stumbling blindly into the press ahead. The battlefield narrowed into a suffocating funnel where movement slowed to a crawl. The weight of thousands of armored bodies compressed the front ranks, pinning men upright, making it impossible to raise a shield, swing a sword, or even breathe freely. Chroniclers describe men suffocating inside their helmets, crushed against one another, their armor turning from protection into a metal coffin. The English archers, having fired every last arrow, refused to stand idle. They dropped their bows, drew short weapons, hatchets, mallets, daggers, and waded into the melee. Light, unarmored, and unencumbered, they moved with an agility the French could not match. They targeted the weak points of plate armor with practiced precision. A blow to a visor hinge. A dagger slipped under an arm, a hammer crushing a gauntlet. Their presence turned the collapsing French line into a scene of brutal dismantling. Henry V remained in the thick of the fight, his helmet dented by a blow from the Duke of Alençon himself. Yet even as the French nobility hurled themselves at the English king, they could not break the disciplined wall of soldiers surrounding him. The French center finally shattered. Panic swept the field. Men attempted to flee but found nowhere to run, only mud, bodies, and chaos. By midday, France's proud chivalric army lay destroyed, not by superior numbers but by poor leadership, disastrous terrain, and Henry's masterful timing. The result was one of the most decisive and humiliating defeats in medieval Europe, a moment that shattered French confidence and carved Henry's name into legend. Agincourt was more than a battle. It was a political earthquake. France had lost many of its greatest nobles. The humiliation was profound. Its military reputation shattered. England, stunned by its own triumph, saw Henry transformed overnight from a young, untested monarch into a legendary king. Agincourt did not end the 100 Years' War, but it reshaped it. It forced France into years of instability. It emboldened English ambitions. It gave Henry the leverage to seize more territory, to negotiate from strength, and to etch his name into history as one of England's greatest battlefield commanders. And centuries later, the field of Agincourt remains a symbol, a reminder that even the finest armor, the greatest numbers, and the proudest nobility can fall before the power of strategy, discipline, and an unyielding will.